Their main fear, and I've shared this with you, is the potential of the convention to exceed its scope. Can you tell us how this legislation ensures that the convention stays within its scope? Calm my fears.
Thank you, ma'am. First, let me also again say thank you for your assistance at the committee level and here on the floor today. It is greatly appreciated. I know particularly your constituents, Senator Estes' constituents, have been concerned. It does it in two ways. One, the actual call of SJR 2, which is not part of consideration here, but it is defined in scope in three areas. Part of the reason we just did Senator Estes' cleanup bill was to ensure that no previous outliers could be brought up and discussed by Texas delegates. We carved out the balanced budget so that should that call occur before SJR 2 call occurs, because look, there's only 8 states right now that have done that. Other states are in the process of reconsideration of it. More specifically, by having a scope of the call, it means that when the Congress, should this call occur, they will set the time and the place of the call, and by having the call being uniform across the states, it ensures that Congress can set that scope when the Article 5 call goes out. The reason the Congress is the executive agent, not the permission grantor. It says they shall call the convention. But the reason the Congress is that executive agent for calling the convention is the states that are not part of the call have to be notified based upon the other 34 states that called for it. We were very diligent in our simulation convention back in September to ensure the scope of what we discussed. And in fact, because this would be a legislative body, we used Mason's rules, which are similar to what we use here. We had the parliamentarian of a legislative body be our parliamentarian for the simulation. In those ways, that's how the scope of this convention is controlled. And the faithful delegate bill, which other legislators or legislatures are adopting in tandem the same way we are here, ensures that it isn't just Texas's delegates that are controlled, but Alaska, Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, the other states that have already done this, or the other states that are in the process of doing it, are doing tandem legislation to ensure that their delegates are faithful to the call that we are asking for.
Pressures that you never experienced today will be in that convention. I'm concerned for our country, and that's the reason I originally asked you, why don't you do it single shot? Because have you thought about how it could get out of control? We don't even know what the political environment of the country will be in the next 10 to 12 years. It may be to your liking, it may not be to your liking. So, have you considered those elements that I'm raising? And even after some of the points I've brought out, do you really think we ought to move forward?
Let me very seriously address your concern, Dean, the way you have seriously addressed me.
Yes, sir.
Early in your comments, you mentioned that you had concern about the caliber of people that would be going to this convention. Back in December, when I sat down with Senator Watson to express or ask his support for this, lay out it conceptually, went through the details of it, one of the things I told him was this. One of the things that frustrates me about the relationship between state officials and federal officials is this assumption, this underlying, call it an institutional inertia, that gentlemen like you and I are somehow incapable of understanding what we're doing. That somehow because we are state legislators, we are somehow a second-class citizen in relationship to members of Congress. I profoundly reject that notion.
Well,
Senator,
I hope you.
Sen- no,
hope you invite it for me.
Senator, let me, because I'm trying to compliment you, my friend.
Go right ahead.
Look, this is serious business.
Very serious.
Let me tell you something.
I appreciate
Your experience of 30 plus years in this Senate and 40, nearly, I guess a little over 40 as a state legislator is highly valuable. And the people that were at this mock convention were legislators from Ohio, Virginia, all the different states, some of which I knew. Do you sit on this floor and not deliberate judiciously? And the answer to that is no. If you went to this convention as a delegate, would you not seriously deliberate? The answer is no, you would. Second, because this is a convention of states, the issues affiliated with internal state issues, like what you described with Price Daniel, those are set aside because the number one concern is rebalancing state authority and state power to rebalance federalism within our national government and its relationships to the states. One of the delegates from Virginia was Major Linghamfelter when I was Captain Birdwall nearly 30 years ago. He ran for lieutenant governor in Virginia. He's been a delegate for many, many years, just like you in the Virginia House of Delegates. There's other people that I did not know, but these are very serious people that we should not assume because they're not federal office holders, they are somehow inadequate to the task. Because if we agree with that, then because we are not federal office holders, then somehow we here in the state Senate are inadequate to the task of governing the state of Texas. And I profoundly reject that logic.
Well, thank you, and you're very passionate about your position. I'm concerned, and I think, quite frankly, some of my colleagues that may vote with you have expressed some concerns. I wouldn't begin to speak for them, but I do just wanted to ask you, had you considered that it's not a legislative body, that you're moving forward creating the process? I've been there. It's a totally different experience, and I would be concerned about the unintended consequences, which it sounds to me like you've weighed, and I would just go about it different. And
the reason I'm not going about
really
it...
don't like Washington, I understand that. And I think if we probably voted, are we pleased with the direction of the federal government, you'd probably have a very bipartisan set of votes showing our disgust. But sometimes you have to be careful how you try to fix something that you could make it worse, and that's my concern.
I share that concern, but the reason we are where we are, George Mason, the founder of the revolution, the father of the revolution,
Yeah, yes, sir.
added this element of Article 5 because if someday, and I believe that day is today, that if the only way to amend the Constitution was from the Congress of the United States and it became its own customer. Look, there are great individual members of that body, but doctrinally it can give us those amendments. But structurally and institutional inertia, there's no way it's going to limit its terms. We've been working on fiscal constraints for how many? We just carved out the balanced budget amendment that we did 40 years ago.
No, I understand. If this is a referendum on, are you happy with Washington, I think I would know how this vote goes.
It's not a matter...
But I think the document is much more serious than any specific outrage that we have towards Washington.
Senator, if you're concerned about the document that we think we're going to amend with this convention, I assure you there's nobody in this building that's more concerned about the seriousness of that nature.
And it's really hard to tell who would be in charge and what issues they would discuss or change that we may not like. We can give them guidance, we can give them some parameters, but at the end of the day, they can pretty much do whatever they want once they meet.
Well, I would make this argument to you about the ultimate constraint on your concern with a runaway convention. is the states have to ratify whatever comes out. 38 states have to ratify anything that might come from such a convention. I believe we've put the proper constraints in place to ensure fidelity of our delegates, and since we're very similar to other states have a similar concern, but the ultimate check is when you do the math, 38 states to ratify means that 13 can block anything that is unsatisfactory. And in fact, at the simulation, while the majority, overwhelmingly the majority, were from the conservative side of the aisle, there were Democrats and more liberal members from liberal states. In fact, in my subcommittee, I had a gentleman from Vermont, the lady from Hawaii, the gentleman from Rhode Island. None of us asked our party affiliation. We were concerned with rebalancing the role of the states as sovereign entities in relationship to the federal government. If we do something so extremely liberal, or if we do something perceived as so extremely conservative, it only takes 13 states to block that. The founders were very clear, and rightly so. It takes 2/3 of the states to call a convention, but it takes 3/4 to ratify anything that might come out of that. And that is our ultimate check. So these are preclusionary checks in my bill, and then on the call bill, the SGR that will eventually come after this bill's done. Those are preclusionary checks before, and then the ratification threshold afterward are the boundaries that we've placed on the concern for what you call an out-of-control convention.
As it relates to this, I want to make certain that we have this discussion. States' rights and balance of power, checks and balance between executive, legislative, and judicial branch of government. One of the areas that this constitutional convention would look into would be overriding Supreme Court decisions, correct?
It could potentially discuss mechanisms by which the states could now decide their concurrence or non-concurrence with Supreme Court decisions.
And the legislative branch of the states would make that decision concerning a judicial decision by the U.S. Supreme Court, right?
The 50 states would have to do so potentially. That is a possibility.
And based on my notes, about two-thirds majority of the states could override a U.S. Supreme Court decision. That's one of the areas that you'd be looking at.
Yes, sir. Because, okay. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, you've anticipated my next question. You can go ahead with the because. Go ahead.
Because the Supreme Court of the United States has decided to abrogate for itself legislative powers. Let me give some examples. It was not a convention of states that changed the definition of marriage. It was not a convention of states that decided that life did not begin until after birth. It was not a convention of states that made other decisions. Does the court have a proper role and function? Yes. But I believe, particularly given the change that the 17th Amendment made, that changed the customer of the United States Senate, we now live under the consent of the appointed, not the consent of the governed.
Okay, so you pointed out several areas where you think the Supreme Court overstepped their constitutional boundaries.
Yes, sir.
Do you believe that they overstepped their constitutional boundaries when they dealt with civil rights type issues?
Let me give you an example, if I may, of what my concern is. In 1875, a Republican Congress passed the first desegregation law, later overturned by the court. In 1884, a Republican Congress passed its second desegregation law, which eventually led to Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, that gave us separate but equal. In 1954, the Supreme Court gave us Brown versus Board of Education. That decision is hailed as a landmark civil rights decision.
It is.
And I agree with that. Here's what my example tells you, though. The people of the United States in 1875 were already passing desegregation laws to ensure that ancestors of your melanin were not going to be discriminated against. The people spoke through their representatives in 1875. But it was not until 1954 that the court caught up to the people. Your ancestors sat in desegregation for 75 years because the people spoke and the court ruled it unconstitutional. While Brown versus Board of Education is a landmark decision, what it really tells us is when you put legislating in the hands of the judicial branch, it will exacerbate and lengthen what's the word I'm looking for, Senator? I want to be very careful, very deliberate here. It lengthened the amount of time that your ancestors were treated as second-class citizens. The court caught up to the American people 70 years later. That 70 years, your ancestors could have been equal partners from 1875. But you did not become equal partners till 1954 because we treated the Supreme Court as the supreme arbiter of the law. They have a proper role and function. But the people of this country are who we consent to, not the appointed.